This one is the survival guide. And this is a book I wrote for teens specifically. And the one that's for adults is called Blessed Youth, Breaking the Silence with Children and Teens About Mental Illness. And one of the reasons why I created these resources is because looking back, I realized that I was a child struggling with my mental health. And I have a child now as a mother who struggles with mental health. I'm an aunt to nephews and nieces who struggle with mental health. And as a pastor, there's children in my congregation who are struggling with their mental health. And so as we enter into this topic tonight about mental health and children and teens and what our faith communities can do, I would like you to take a moment to think of a child in your life. This could be a young child, it could be a baby, it could be an elementary school, middle school, high school. So I'll give you a moment to have that young person's face come into mind. And if you are able to write down their name on a piece of paper or type it in your phone, go ahead and write down their name. And as you're thinking about this young person, what about them brings a smile to your face? And what about them makes you feel worried? There's something that they're facing or going through that you worry about for them. So I would like to say that this is for them. Whichever child came to your mind, what we're doing tonight is for them. And it's for you as someone who cares about that young person, and it's for me. And so the person that comes to my mind is my niece, Sydney, who lived with different mental health challenges, was very bright, high achieving, top in her class. And we did not know that she was really struggling until it was too late. And so we lost her to suicide when she was 16. And this is dedicated to her. She taught me a lot about the bravery of talking about mental health challenges. And so this book, Survival Guide, is what she wanted. She talked about bringing mental health resources to her school. And she talked about educating students about what are the warning signs, what are the resources to get help. And so in this survival guide is a toolkit for young people. There's spaces within the pages for them to create their own local mental health resource. And there is a safety pledge. We are at the point in our society where we need to invite every child to have a safety pledge. And faith communities have done similar things. There has been pledges around purity, around human sexuality, and inviting young people to promise to honor their sexuality and to maybe, not have sex until they're married. That's one example. And that was a pretty strong effort. And they had conversations with youth about that. And I feel like it's time for our faith communities to have conversations with our youth about their safety and their mental health. And that if they have thoughts about dying or not wanting to live, that they would promise to tell a trusted adult and to have a plan. Who are those 3 adults? What are their names? What are their phone numbers? And to prepare themselves that if they're starting to have thoughts to tell an adult. Sometimes young people will tell peers, but what we know is that we haven't trained our peers what to do if someone tells them. My niece disclosed her suicide attempts to her peers, but they didn't know what to do with the information. They didn't realize how serious it was. So my prayer is that giving our youth these tools will help save at least one life. And with this survival guide, I wanted to read to you, it starts out with a little note. Dear blessed youth, it's okay to not be okay. Tell an adult that you're not okay. It gets better. There is help. You are loved. You are not alone. Your life matters. I care about you. Stay. P.S. No matter what, you are loved. I also share this guide will give you tools to survive when you are feeling or thinking disconnected and confused, lost and alone. No one else feels what I feel. No one is there for me. What's wrong with me? Because no one else seems to feel this way. There's something different about me. My life sucks. I hate myself. I suck. I'm stupid. I'm a disappointment. Everyone hates me. My life has no meaning. I don't know how to get help. I can't do this anymore. I don't want my life to be like this. I know people who want to die, but I don't know how to help them. I don't know what's happening to me, but I need help. And I'm not okay. Those statements are statements that youth themselves have reported feeling. And we know that these types of feelings and thoughts are happening at higher and higher levels across youth in our societies. Next slide. So one of the big messages to get out there is that it's okay to not be okay. And I see some generational challenges in this message. I'm 45, and I'm kind of right in the middle there. You know, growing up in the 80s, we didn't really talk about mental illness, especially in the church. And that's why my first book, Breaking the Silence About Mental Illness, Family, and Church, was me telling the story that my family growing up, we were not okay. I didn't have the language to use, so I used the word crazy because my life felt crazy. I felt crazy. I thought my dad was crazy. But things were not okay at home, but we didn't feel like we had permission or that it was socially acceptable to say to anyone that things were not okay. And it was the type of situation in the 80s and 90s where you wear your best clothes to church, you wear a smile to church, you wear that mask. And heaven forbid you should really share what was really going on. I see that in our younger generations, they are more comfortable sharing with each other that things are not okay. And it's the adults and grandparents that are not as comfortable. And so I invite you all to role model, because that's one of the most powerful ways that we can connect to our youth, is to really role model to them when we're not okay, and to be vulnerable and authentic so that they see, okay, you know, my grandpa's not okay, but this is what he's doing to help him feel better. We've had great examples in the Olympics for the US Olympic team. Simone Biles, you may have heard that big story about her mental health challenges. And she just said right in the middle of her Olympic Games, I can't do this, I'm not okay. And so that is really the role modeling I encourage us to demonstrate. But it's hard because there's this stigma. And what stigma is a sense of shame. And there is self-stigma. And that is one of the biggest barriers to getting support for mental health challenges, is our own inner stigma. And so I encourage you to practice this phrase, it's okay to not be okay. And to try using it this week. And try sharing that with another person. You know, when we do those informal greetings, how are you today? How are you? I'm fine, I'm fine. And you can say, wait, are you really okay? Because it's okay to not be okay. You know, we all have times where we're really not okay. And you can open up a deeper conversation. And that leads to connection. Next slide. So here are some statistics that tell us a story. And as we think about this, I want you to think about, what story do the numbers tell? Now, this is about the stats in the United States, but I think There's similar data you could find in Canada. In the United States, youth age 6 to 17 experience a mental illness each year. 50% of all lifetime mental illness begins by age 14. 75% of mental illness begins by age 24. Now, what that tells me, and I've heard others in the mental health field say this as well, mental illness, mental health challenges, these are pediatric illnesses. Have you ever heard that before? I just heard that recently, but it makes so much sense. Mental health challenges, mental health disorders, mental illness are pediatric illnesses. But it takes so long for people to get diagnosed, to get evaluated, to get treatment, to get to the place of recovery. And a lot of times it's when there's a crisis, when they're a late teens, young adult, where they finally get the attention they need. But if you look back at their life, there were early signs at a very young age of a mental health challenge. An expert at the hospital in Columbus, Ohio, in pediatrics said that there can be newborns that demonstrate anxiety. And so there are really signs that at newborn life of a mental health challenge. And the reason why it's so important to know that is that early intervention, early treatment leads to better outcomes. 1 in 5 adults in the US will have a mental illness in a given year. And 1 in 20 will have a serious mental illness. And those numbers have gone up during the pandemic. These were pre-pandemic numbers. The National Alliance on Mental Illness today reports that 2 of 5. So 2 of every 5 people in the US will have a mental health challenge in any given year. So as you think about your congregation and your faith community, 2 out of 5 people are going through something. And our children have similar numbers. It makes it challenging because we want to be able to support our children, but often the care providers, the parents, are going through a mental health challenge themselves. And so this is really a holistic opportunity to take care of the whole family, the parents as well as the children. Next slide. There is a very new report done by the New York Times. You may have seen it, but I want to draw your attention to it. It is in response to what in the United States is being called a mental health crisis. We had a message from the Surgeon General who issued an advisory on youth mental health crisis. That advisory came out in December of 2021. And so because of that advisory, we've been researching the issue more. And so I want to reference this video that you will get a link to. It's called Worried Sick, A Journey into the Anxious Teenage Mind. And it looks at why are so many American teenagers feeling anxious, depressed, and suicidal. And there's a lot of brain science behind that. And so I do recommend this video to you. Next slide. So for people of faith, what can we do? You know, there is a huge need for therapists, psychologists, social workers, for hospitals, for treatment centers, for recovery programs, teachers. But what is our role in the church? And that's really the question that excites me and that I want to focus our time on tonight. As people of faith, we believe that God is still speaking, that God is with us, that we are created in God's image. And I believe that God is love and that God loves all of us. And so when we experience suffering and pain, diseases, disorders, illness, there's often that question of where is God? Growing up in my family, I asked that question as a child. Where is God in this moment? When my father is having a manic bipolar episode and I felt scared and frightened, I wanted to know where was God. We were churchgoers, and I felt comforted going to church and being told that God loved me, that I was God's child. And for a person who was in a home where there was instability, where things were not okay, where my father was not mentally well, where there was emotional abuse and neglect, the church filled that role of providing a guardian of love. And so if God is the guardian of love, if God loves all of us no matter what, then what does that mean for children facing mental illness and for their families? I believe there is real power as a faith community to proclaim that we are blessed. And that needs to be an intentional proclamation because Christian history has interpreted mental illness to be a curse. And you can probably think of the stories in the Bible that describe mental illness in that way. One of the most prominent is the Gerasene demoniac, the man who is out of his mind. He's naked, he's in chains in a cemetery, he is harming himself with rocks. When Jesus comes to the shore, he breaks free from the chains and runs to Jesus. And in that encounter with Jesus, the demon, the evil spirit, is cast out of him. And then he gets his right mind back. Many have interpreted that story to say that a mental illness like that is demon possession, is evil spirits. When I was a chaplain in the psychiatric hospital, I had patients who believed that is what was happening to them. And so I want to ask you to really explore that kind of theology. Because if mental illness is an evil spirit, what does that say about God and where God shows up? I think it can lead to harm. It can put people in a place where God is not present in their mind or in their body. And so what I encourage you to do is proclaim that we are blessed, that we are made in God's image, and that mental illness is a biological condition. It's our brain. Just like our hearts have a heart attack, our brain can have a brain attack. I get brain attacks. They're called migraines. And sometimes my migraines are so serious, I am impaired. The definition of a disability is a mental or physical impairment. And sometimes my mental health challenge disables me. Is my migraine attack an evil spirit? Is it a curse from God? Growing up with my family's serious mental illness, I had what are called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And all of this in the environment impacted my mental health so that today I have post-traumatic stress disorder. Am I cursed by God? Is my family cursed? We now have 3 generations of bipolar disorder. My father has bipolar. He died from untreated bipolar. My brother has bipolar disorder, serious. He is on full disability for it. He was a college professor, but his mind is disabled. And now my nephew, who's 12, has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So in that example, it could be so easy for me to read the scriptures about the demon possession and to say, well, my family is cursed, 3 generations of bipolar disorder. We have evil spirits in my family. But what does that kind of theology do for us? And what does that kind of theology say about God? I'm curious what your answers would be to that. I don't have all the answers, but what my heart tells me is that the idea of being blessed feels a whole lot better than thinking I'm cursed. Feeling like I'm cursed with generational mental illness feels like I'm in the tomb when they crucified Jesus and put his dead body in a tomb and rolled the rock in front of it. That's what it feels like to me, to being cursed. It's death. There's no life. And so I invite you into the liberative theology of mental health justice that really focuses on the blessing. So blessed is a word that honors our whole story. It doesn't focus on that one part of us that is disabled or that has an illness or a disorder. Blessed means that we're more than the stigma and more than the shame of our conditions. Blessed means we are more than our labels. Blessed means we are holy and whole. We are blessed. So I invite you to claim your blessedness. And as you do the work of mental health ministry, as you minister to families and people of all ages, sometimes mental health disorders developed in our senior years, I would encourage you to think of how we are blessed in our mind, body, and spirit, and that God is in the blessing, that God is still blessing us. In some of the newest brain research, there is part of our brain that is impacted by certain forms of mental illness that is the spiritual part of our brain. So the brain science is so amazing. They can find which part of the brain processes spirituality, and they can see that sometimes, for example, major depressive disorder, it can interfere with our spiritual part of our brain. And so it can seem as if God has abandoned us because the depression in the brain is impacting spiritual connection. And so that is why the faith community needs to remind people that even though they don't feel God's presence, God is still with them. Even though you might feel cursed, God's not cursing you. God loves you. Even though you might feel like there's something wrong with you, you are made in the image of God. And so those are all messages you can share in your worship services, in a sermon, in a prayer, in a children's message. And there's no age that's too young to start hearing these messages. So as we think about this topic, I really invite you to join me in imagining how healing it can be to speak blessing into people's lives and to acknowledge that mental health challenges can be caused by the brain, by the environment, and to really steer away from this idea that it's a curse or an evil spirit. My interpretation of the Gerasene demoniac is that he was alienated by his community who did not like his behavior. And when he encountered Jesus, he was healed through a relationship and a connection with Jesus. That's what healed him. And so how often in our societies do we alienate and isolate and put in jail or prison or death row people whose behaviors we don't approve of? It's our form of punishment, and how that really contributes to their disorder, their sense of mental illness. Faith communities are called to liberate people, to bring them into relationship, into community, and into connection. And that is how we can be a blessing. Next slide. So I want to encourage you as you go into your faith communities and lead your faith communities, what stories do you tell about mental health in your faith communities? What God stories? I talked about the Gerasene demoniac, but really the whole Bible can be read through the lens of mental health. We can break the silence about mental illness with children at church by telling stories about God's care for our mental health. I love reading through the Psalms. There are so many times in the Psalms where emotions are lifted up, where we lament, cry out, we have tears, we have anger, and each time the psalmist brings us back to God's presence. Psalm 23 is my favorite. It is about the valley of the shadow. And for me, I talk about the valley of the shadow of mental illness. And in that psalm, we're reminded that God is with us, even through the valley of the shadow of mental illness. And so these are stories that we can share with our children, and we can be intentional about our language. There's a children's sermon that I like to give that starts with this idea that when you have a cold, you use tissues to blow your nose. Sometimes you have to take cold medicine. Sometimes if your cold's really bad, you have to go see a doctor and get a prescribed medicine. Just like you can get a cold and get sick, our brains can get sick. And so sometimes we need to see a doctor and take medicine for our brains. And that God gives us people to care about us and to help us find healing and wholeness. So that's just a very simple example of how you can teach children that it's okay to talk about their mental health and to share about what they're going through. I also want to encourage you to find ways to lift up stories from your local context. One of the most powerful ways to open up conversation is to share a personal experience. And in my local church, these can be called mission moments. You can have people share testimonies, and you can have people show by example that it's okay to be authentic, to be vulnerable, and to ask for support. Our congregations need to be trained in how to do that. And so there are different programs that can help you do that. Pathways to Promise is a program that offers companionship training. And it trains people for how do you companion someone who is going through a mental health challenge? How do you show up alongside them and offer the emotional support? One of the things that we're finding with the mental health crisis for children and youth is that one of the leading risk factors for developing a mental health challenge is isolation. The youth, and these were high school students who were surveyed, who felt connected. And what was interesting, it was in person or online. It really didn't matter if it was online or in person, but the youth who felt a connection to another person had protection from developing more serious mental health challenges. And our faith communities can be those places of meaningful connection. We could go to the next slide. So I encourage you again to find ways to have conversations in your church, to talk to your children about it. Churches and faith communities can be great places for basic education. You can have book studies, and you can bring in experts from the mental health community to lead a seminar, to lead a book study, to have a resource fair. Those are all great ways to bring in the conversation into your church. So that's another invitation I have for you. What God's stories are you telling about mental health? Next slide. I especially want to focus on teens. And I wonder, as you thought of the young person in your life, how many of you thought of a teenager? My child will be 13 this summer, and so we are very close to being full into the teen years. But as I think more about teenagers, I see how blessed they are. I believe that teens carry inside of them the power of transformation. How are the teens in your life? They don't know that they are so powerful. I think there is so much going on inside of them, it can feel overwhelming. I believe with the support of the faith community, we can remind our teens that they are blessed and that God has given them a life with purpose and meaning, and that they can be a blessing in the world. The invitation for us as adults is to show up and to listen and to be there alongside them without judgment. When I've talked to teenagers in the church about mental health, they told me that they weren't really comfortable talking about mental health with the adults in their church. And when I asked them why, it came down to them being worried that they would disappoint the adults in church. They did not want to disappoint the adults. They wanted adults in their life and at church to be proud of them. So many times we give attention to our youth when they make these great accomplishments, when they win a game in sports or get an A, or all of these performance-oriented things. But what if there were ways to recognize and bless our youth simply for being who they are without expecting them or asking them to perform? I wonder if that would create a less judgmental environment. Because right now, a lot of teens are worried that they will disappoint us. And so they keep locked inside their stories and their struggles. They also don't want to be judged. They also are concerned that we won't take them seriously. Because of our generational differences, we may not be able to understand what they're really going through. And so they are worried that we will brush them aside or say, well, I made it through it, so why can't you? So one of the biggest ways we can support teens is to really listen without judgment and to shower blessings upon them for simply being who they are, and not as a reward or a celebration of some performance or accomplishment. How are the teens in your life? And how can you and your faith community be a blessing to them? Next slide. In my book, I talk about schools. In the United States, there's some debate about social emotional learning and whether or not it's appropriate to teach that in schools. But schools are a place where our children and teens spend a lot of time. And I believe that the schools can be a blessing. And so I say, blessed are the schools, because within the school community, we can empower our youth to take flight, soaring into the future with strength and hope. And one great example of a school that is being a blessing is in San Antonio, Texas. They have partnered with NAMI in San Antonio, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and created a mental health club. So that's an interesting approach. It's a before school activity where youth can opt in, but it's a club for any youth that wants to learn more about mental health, that wants support for their mental health. And it's really developing leaders in the field of mental health. And it's encouraging peer support. Our research shows us that for youth, peer support is critical, and it can create that safe place for conversations. And so as a faith community, I'm curious about the schools in your neighborhood and how the faith community can be an advocate for bringing social and emotional learning to your schools. Can you be an advocate for counselors in the school, social workers in the school? Can your church and faith community bring a mental health club? If not to the school, maybe your faith community can have a mental health club at your church or at your faith community. There is a lot of energy in the US around this idea of schools being a place where people have access to mental health care that's affordable. In the US, so many of the high-risk students are Black and brown and low income, and they don't have easy access to mental health care services. So one of the strategies we are looking at is how to bring mental health care services into the school so that during their school day, they can have access to quality care. And I believe faith communities can be an advocate to advocate for those kinds of resources and support in our schools. Next slide. Is it safe to ask for help? This is something that our children and teens and youth really pick up on. They know whether or not it is safe to share and safe to ask for help. Central to empowering youth is creating intentional spaces where they can talk openly and honestly about their needs and where it is okay to ask for help. How do you create those spaces in your faith community that make it easy to ask for help? I have encouraged faith communities in your engagements with youth to do a mental health check-in every time you gather. And it can be as simple as thumbs down, it's not good mental health day. It could be just so-so or thumbs up. It doesn't take very long to just do a moment where you're checking in regularly with your youth and you're showing them that it's okay when you're having a thumbs down day to let us know, and that we will support you and work to get you help. One of the myths around mental health and children and teens is that by talking about mental health, we'll plant seeds in their minds of serious mental illness, self-harm, or suicide. But that is not the case. Children and teens are already thinking about these things, experiencing them in their peers. And when we talk about it, we're saying we're safe people to talk about this with. It is hard to talk about suicide, but part of breaking the silence and ending the stigma is knowing how to do so in a safe way. And so there's lots of suicide prevention trainings that you can take time to do for yourself, and I would encourage you to do that. But it is important to ask if someone has a plan, and if they do, to get them help immediately. I wish we had asked our niece, but it was scary to talk about it. And we just did not want to imagine that she was in so much pain. And so a lot of this is overcoming our own sense of anxiety, our own fears, and to be brave and show up authentically, willing to dialogue with people and really hear how they're doing. And then to know what are your local resources for help. In the US, we have a new helpline. It's a parallel to 911. So 911 for our country is the general emergency number. And now we will have 988. And this is our emergency number for a mental health crisis. So I'm curious for you all in the United Church of Canada, what are your emergency numbers and hotlines? I would encourage you to put them in your phone so you always have them right at your fingertips. Next slide. So this is just a reminder of what we can do as adults. How can we bless our youth? In my book, and I believe that we talk about how as parents, grandparents, care providers, as faith communities, as schools, as wider communities, there are things we can do to bless our youth. We are not powerless. It's an overwhelming challenge. It is a crisis. And we have the tools to rise to this occasion and to bless our youth. So the number one thing that all of us can do is to educate ourselves. Learn about mental health first aid, learn about the resources in your community, learn about the warning signs for mental health challenges and the risk factors. You also need to take care of your own mental health. And that sometimes is the hardest thing to do. I have had to learn that if I want to be a healthy wife, a healthy mother, a healthy pastor, I need to take care of my own mental health. And so for me, that means being in regular talk therapy, having a holistic plan for my health, nutrition, exercise, spending time outside in nature, yoga. Those are things I do for my mental health. We have marriage counseling, family counseling. For me, the counseling approach really works. So I wonder what works for you. How do you take care of your mental health? Don't wait until there's a crisis. Patrick Kennedy is an advocate in the US, and he always says, did you have your checkup from the neck up? Just like you have your physical exam every year, you really need to have a checkup from the neck up, a mental health check. And that will help you be on top of your own mental health. And the last part is to be an advocate. And really what an advocate is someone who speaks up. You know, if you're at the table, if you are in the room, if you are in places where people are making decisions about resources, you can be an advocate for children and teens, for schools, to bring in mental health education and mental health resources. Don't sit there silently while so many people are suffering. Break the silence. Talk about mental health and be an advocate for better mental health resources. These are all ways that we can be a blessing to our youth. Next slide. We also know that a high risk for developing mental health challenges are youth who are LGBTQ, who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, straight, and transgender. Being a teenager going through puberty, it is a time of lots of changes, hormonal changes, physical changes, lots of emotions and lots of exploration, exploring self-identity, gender identity, sexuality. And so especially faith communities can support the mental well-being of teens by creating spaces that are safe for open dialogue about human sexuality and gender identity. In the United Church of Christ, we have two different programs that help us do this. One is the open and affirming movement, where churches can create a covenant that talks about their radical hospitality and their love for LGBTQ people, that God loves LGBTQ people, and that our church celebrates and includes and honors and welcomes. Children notice that. That matters to children and teens' mental health for your faith community to be open and affirming. The United Church of Christ has partnered with the Unitarian Universalists to create Our Whole Lives. So that is a human sexuality curriculum that is very in-depth and will give your faith community the tools to talk about human sexuality in a way that is healthy and that will be a blessing to teens and youth. Next slide. So in wrapping up this part of the program, I encourage you to explore this resource, Blessed Youth, Breaking the Silence About Mental Illness with Children and Teens. It's just published today, so you can find this book along with the next book on the next slide. This is the survival guide that I talked about earlier that has the personalized safety plan, a place to develop a toolkit, a place to make a safety pledge that I believe everyone needs, not just teenagers, but all of us really need to have people in mind that we can talk to when we're really having thoughts of self-harm or suicide. Next slide. So these are available through Chalice Press on Amazon and in your local bookstores. The survival guide comes in bundles of 5. So it's a pocket-sized little booklet like this. And so you can get it in groups of 5. And really, I would love every youth in your church to have one. And then the other book is a general size book. And you can get them from the publisher or on Amazon or in your local bookstore. Next slide. I want you to stay in touch. And so that is my website, sarahgriffithlund.com. And then my email is sarahgriffithlund@gmail.com. Would love to continue conversations with you. I do consultations with local churches and faith communities, and would love to work with you and your faith community. And we can put those in the chat. So Springwater and I are going to have some conversation with you about the intersectionality, because mental health is impacted by physical health, it's impacted by emotional health, it's impacted by our cultures. And when we talk about justice, mental health justice means overcoming discrimination. And we talk about that in terms of ableism. Ableism is when we discriminate against people because of their disability or mental health challenge. And so what happens in our society when ableism intersects with racism, where young people of color experience oppression because of racism, but also oppression because of ableism. Maybe they are neurodiverse, their minds are different, maybe they have autism. And so how can we as faith communities work to bring healing to our youth who are experiencing multiple levels of oppression? And so Springwater, I would love to invite you to share a little bit about the healing work that you're doing with Indigenous youth.
Well, it's been a while since I've been actually out on the road. It's been over 2 years now. But part of my ministry with the United Church is, for sure, we do, one of the programs that we do is out in Saskatchewan, out by Prince Albert, and it's an equine assisted learning program. And there we specifically work with either young Indigenous males or young Indigenous females. And, they have their own space to, to work on their self, to work on how they communicate. All of our leadership is Indigenous or First Nations people. When we have specific programs that are for Indigenous young men, I take a back seat. I'm there for the administrative roles. We have a solid group of young Indigenous men who facilitate a lot of that programming. They're able to do ceremony every day. We do mental health check-ins every morning. We do it through the morning smudge and, our prayers and what have you. We talk about the impacts that racism has on their mental well-being, their spiritual well-being, what it can do to their physical bodies, and we try to really provide them with some solid tools and some of the language that might be needed to, speak up for oneself, because, it's really super challenging to do that for a lot of people, especially when you're young. And then on top of that, when you're living in a place like Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, where they're known for, not necessarily treating Indigenous people in the best of ways. We try our best to connect them after the program with mental health resources, and whether it be their local Indigenous organization or what have you, that, to assist in that work, because it's ongoing. It doesn't stop, or it doesn't end with the 1 week program that I facilitate.
Thank you, Springwater, so much. It's important work that you're doing, and we can all learn from each other and support each other. And I wonder if you can highlight for us, as you shared with me earlier, about the medicine wheel.
So I'm sure, or just a show of hands, how many people are familiar with it? Can anybody tell me what the 4 quadrants are in terms of the self? No? So we have the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And, it's our belief that, if any one of those parts of the self is out of balance, then everything is out of balance. So if you're, I thought it was really interesting what you were talking about, Sarah, about that, the study about, the spiritual part of the brain and how mental health can impact that, and so that medicine wheel, that's what it teaches us. When one part of that is off balance just a little bit, it impacts the entire self.
Thank you so much. I learn every time I meet with groups and share. And so know that we can learn from each other and that all of us have mental health. We all have physical health. We all have mental health. We are spiritual beings. There is a new book out by Dr. Lisa Miller called The Awakened Brain. I highly recommend it to you. She does cutting edge research about the intersection of spirituality and mental health. And she looks at children as well. And her argument is that one of the reasons why we're seeing heightened cases of mental health challenges is we've really lost touch with our spiritual nature. And the more we can connect children to their own spiritual nature, the more we will pour into their mental health, the more we will bless them with positive mental health. And it's back to the medicine wheel, right? So now we're having Western science, come and really affirm what Indigenous communities have known for a long time. And so Dr. Miller's research has a lot of good data that shows the importance of children developing spirituality. And one of her biggest arguments is about this idea of a child feeling connected to a higher power that cares for them. So that no matter what the child goes through, how scary, how harmful, how awful, they will know that God, higher power, the great healer, the great counselor, whatever name you want to put to that, is with them in whatever they're experiencing in life. And that profound sense of being loved by a higher power, being connected to a higher power, can literally save someone's life. And so as people of faith, we have so much we can offer the world. And sometimes we're shy to share our faith and to share this gospel message of love. But, I might sound like a hippie, but love can save the world. And now we're seeing brain research that says, yes, in fact, conveying to someone and showing and demonstrating and being a community that surrounds people in love has so many positive benefits for mental health. And so go back to that child that I invited you to think of in the beginning and bring back before your mind their face. Remember again what it is about them that makes you smile. Remember what it is about them that you worry about or that concerns you. And I want you to sense how God is calling you to be a blessing in that child's life. What is one thing that you can do based on our conversation that will bless that child, that will help that child know how deeply they are loved by you and by God, how you are a safe person that they can tell if it's that they're not okay, that they know they can trust you with that and that you'll still love them and support them. That's what this work is about. Mental health ministry, mental wellness in the church is about these relationships where we can tell the true stories, where we can connect deeply to one another, pray for each other, help each other get connected to resources. We're going to spend the last bit of our time together in small groups. And Springwater, we're going to pray for you for tech support. but we are going to put you in groups of 5 or 6. And the invitation is to take 15 minutes in your small groups to share what is one thing that the Spirit is leading you to do with this information. You can also share, if you're comfortable, about the child that comes to your mind and what the Spirit might be leading you to do for children that you care about. But I really hope that you can share with each other some practical next steps as we work together to bless our youth. So we will come back at 15 minutes after the hour. So we'll have the next 15 minutes in small groups, and then we'll come back in 15 minutes and have a closing wrap-up time. Welcome back. I hope that your breakout rooms were a blessing to you. Thank you for showing up tonight. I'm so grateful for your time. Your time is valuable, and you were here, and I pray that there was a purpose for you tonight, that you felt connected, inspired, that you feel led to do the next step. And so as we close our time tonight, I want to invite you to share, what is your one next step? And let's share using the chat box. So if you can put in the chat box, what is one step that the Spirit is calling you to do as relates to mental health, mental wellness, with children and teens, or maybe in your own family or your faith community? Your next step might inspire someone else to their next step. And maybe you'll find connection, that you have similar hopes or dreams and can collaborate with one another. Mental illness lies and tells us that we are alone. And so tonight, I hope that you've heard loud and clear that you are not alone. It's the stigma of mental illness that isolates us. And so one of the greatest gifts we can give to each other is a sense of community, being connected. It's okay to not be okay. You're not alone in that. We're going to be here with you through that valley of the shadows. And so go ahead and share in the chat. What do you want to do? How will you bless the youth? And so please feel free to share with us. And as you read through those next steps, let's pray. Pray for the person sharing, and pray for that next step to unfold with God's blessing. So I see a lot of comments about being a good listener, to help youth feel valued. To talk about mental health is something everyone experiences, and to ask specifically, I love that. How is your mental health? Follow up on the resources, the book by Dr. Lisa Miller, The Awakened Brain, that news story by the New York Times and their video. Did you have a checkup from the neck up? Talk to people about that. Normalize conversations about mental health. Talk to parents about mental health. They don't have to be afraid of it. I think some of that fear comes from being overwhelmed and feeling like, well, I'm not an expert. I'm not a psychologist. There's no way I can talk about it. But we are all the experts of our own lives. And all of us have mental health. And so we don't need to be afraid to talk about it. Mental health is on a spectrum. And sometimes we can change where we are on that spectrum day to day. And it's nothing to be afraid of, but to find the blessing in honoring our mind, body, and soul, and that sacred connection. I would love to close our time together by sharing with you my heart. And so when I do this ministry, I always struggle internally with my head and my heart, And I want to just go from my head space, because for me, there's a safety in being intellectual and talking about data and numbers. And when I share from my heart space, I feel really vulnerable. And so I'm going to trust you all with some vulnerability, because I believe that's where God really shows up in our spaces. And so this is part of my closing words in my book. that I would love to share with you as we end. So I shared with you at the beginning that I do this work for a lot of children and youth in my lives. And one of the youths that I do this for is my niece, Sydney. And when she died, I got the phone call and I was on a plane the next day to go and support my brother and our family as they were grieving, the tragedy and the aftermath. And so I had a lot of emotions on that plane ride from Indiana to Texas, just processing what had happened. And I was very tired, and I think I fell asleep on the flight, and I had a dream. I had a dream about my niece, Sydney, and I still dream about her. And so this is what I share in my book. I dreamed about Sydney after she died. She was this giant girl walking across the earth, so tall, her head was as high as the moon, her legs so long that in one step she could cross the continents. In my dream, I saw Sydney step off of the earth because her spirit was too big for this world. Beyond the earth, I feel she is still part of us. I believe she is still here with us to show us the way forward. Sydney's light shines on in a constellation of hope. Even though many systems and communities failed her, Sydney believed that we could make things better for youth with mental health challenges. We can use our voices and be advocates for mental health education, resources, and support in schools and faith communities. We can ensure that communities do not harm our youth. We can write to our elected officials and demand that they prioritize mental health resources and services for children and teens. So what I want to know is this: why do you care about blessed youth? Why do you care about blessed youth? And who are the children entrusted into your care? And how are the children doing in your community? How are the children in your community? Go back to the child that I invited you to remember when we started, and hold that child in your heart and in your mind and in your spirit. Allow that child to continue to inspire you to do this important and life-saving work of breaking the silence about mental illness and mental health challenges. I believe that every person here and everyone who views this recording, that you are part of the solution to the mental health crisis facing children and teens. I believe that working together with children and teens, we can find tremendous hope. And I believe in our blessed youth. I truly believe in their power. I believe in their deep courage. And I believe with all my heart that our children and teens, they deserve so much better. Blessed are the youth, for they are the way forward. May you be a blessing in all that you do and in who you are and how you live your life. Thank you all for joining me in this sacred conversation. God bless you.